faut être vraiment pourri pour dire des choses pareilles.
A man is fishing on the River Marne close to Poissy in the eastern suburbs of Paris. When out of nowhere he sees a suitcase strapped to a cinder block floating in the water. When he opens the case, he sees a human torso. No head, no arms, no legs. This gruesome discovery will set in motion one of the most fascinating criminal investigations of recent times. The case in earnest began a few months earlier in the west of France. This is Crime Dog. Roll the intro. Patricia Hettier is worried. She has been unable to get hold of her father for the last few days. His name is Bernard Hettier. He is 55 years old and he works as a foreman in a chemical manufacturing plant. They are close and would talk regularly. She would go around and see him at least once a week. But recently, every time she went round, he wasn't there. He was also missing from work. Nobody knew where he was and he had no reason to skip town. Patricia has no idea where he could have gone, but she has a bad feeling. On the 29th of June, she goes to the police station in Nancy and tells them she can't find her father. The officers, however, don't take her very seriously. They make a record of her visit and tell her he'll probably show up at some point. A few more days go by and there's still no sign. Aware that the police weren't going to help, Patricia heads to the offices of L'Est Républicain, the local newspaper, and asks them to publish a missing persons ad. She also decides to start her own investigation. Firstly, she heads to her dad's home and she speaks to all the neighbours, and boy do they have some information for her. The previous Saturday, June the 22nd, the neighbours had spotted Bernard's ex-mistress, a lady by the name of Simone Weber. She was sat in her car outside his house. Apparently when Bernard got home from work, he saw the car and he just kept on driving. When he came back later, she was still there, so he invited her in. However, the door remained ajar and the neighbours overheard them arguing. He said he didn't want to see her again, to which she replied, "I'll kill you." This information didn't come as much as a surprise to Patricia. Her father had already told her about Simone. They had started seeing each other in October of '81, when Bernard had been working in Simone's garden. But he broke it off after about a year, having grown tired of her jealousy and her possessive nature. Earlier on in 1985, Patricia had run into Simone Weber. She'd gone round to her dad's house to say hello, and there she was repairing a car. When Patricia asked her who she was, she introduced herself as Madame Hettier, Bernard's wife. Of course, they were by no means married at this time. She remembered warning him that she had a strange feeling about this Simone Weber. He told her to stop worrying. How could such a little woman do him any harm? She is convinced that Weber is somehow involved in her father's disappearance. But how? Bernard Hettier has now been missing for a week. Patricia speaks to her dad's sisters, who had just paid a visit to Simone Weber's apartment. When they got there, she was in the middle of a deep clean, but also her hands were bandaged up. Apparently she hurt herself gardening. She won't look the sisters in the eye. She seems uneasy. They ask if she'd heard from Bernard. She says she hadn't seen him since she'd gone round the previous weekend. Patricia then gets a call. It's from her dad's employers, who just received a bizarre letter. It's a sick note detailing her dad's absence. However, his social security number is missing and the handwriting and his signature don't match. It looks like someone has posted a fake sick note trying to pass themselves off as Bernard. If they think he's just sick, no one will bother looking for him. When the Nancy Police Department received the call from Bernard's employer, they start to take the case a little more seriously. It seems obvious from the get-go that Bernard is not off sick. So who is hiding behind this mysterious sick note? Two officers are handed the case, and the first thing they do is trace the sick note back to the source. It had been posted from a doctor's office in the Paris region, so they pay the doctor a visit. He'd signed off on it, but when he'd been shown a picture of Bernard, he said that wasn't the man who came into his office that day. He had written the sick note for a much younger man. It doesn't take them long to track this person down. His name is Pascal Lamoureux, and he is the boyfriend of Brigitte Weber, who is Simone Weber's daughter. They bring him in for questioning and he claims that he went to the doctors under the orders of Simone Weber. According to her, they were trying to do Bernard a favour and prevent him from getting into trouble, as he was often off work. They check with the factory though, who say quite the opposite. He was a great employee and he was never off sick. Up until this point, detectives didn't really think there was anything going on here. But why falsify the sick note? What if Patricia was right all along? Certain that Madame Weber knows more than she's letting on, They pay her a visit at her home in Nancy, but there's no sign of her. They interview the neighbours who, amongst them, don't really have a nice word to say about her. They work their way down to the Hags, an elderly couple living on the ground floor directly below Madame Weber's apartment. Their testimony is absolute dynamite. On the night of the 23rd, the day that Bernard went missing, they heard a distinct bang come from her apartment, as if something heavy had fallen, followed by a loud noise from some kind of machine, maybe a vacuum cleaner. That's not all. Mary Haag states that around 6 a.m. she was awoken by some strange noises. She takes a cheeky look through the peephole in her door, and she spots Madame Weber walking down the stairs, carrying heavy bin bags. She then sees her place said bin bags in the back of her car. As they try to digest this explosive information, they also discover that Bernard's car, a blue Renault 9, has disappeared. The plot thickens. The case is entrusted to Judge Gilbert Thiel, a magistrate as tenacious as he was meticulous. Patricia is demanding that Madame Weber be arrested immediately. However, there's nothing the judge can do right now. Suspicions are one thing, but they need some proof to be able to proceed with any kind of arrest. No car, no body, no evidence to arrest her at this stage. The judge is convinced that Bernard's car holds the key to this investigation. Did he skip town in it, or did someone make the car disappear to make it look like he'd left of his own volition? They can't arrest Madame Weber just yet, but they do put her under 24-hour surveillance. But she is wily. She knows she's being tracked, so she's very careful. To be fair, they were driving a car with a massive antenna sticking out the roof, so they weren't being particularly subtle. It's September 85 now, and after weeks of cat and mouse, they are struggling. They had hoped that she would lead them to the Renault, but she's way too on her guard. They switch tactics and start listening to her calls. They intercept calls between Simone and her sister Madeleine, who lives in Cannes on the Côte d'Azur, and the sisters keep referring to someone called Bernadette. Police dig deeper and they find no one in or close to the family with that name. They think it's a code. They think they're talking about Bernard's car. Later on that month, they intercept another call. Simone tells her sister to play a series of numbers in the upcoming lottery game. The police don't buy it though, they think it's another code. And when they analyse the numbers, it corresponds to the phone box outside Madeleine Weber's house, combined with a time at which the call would be made. Sneaky. Unaware that they're being traced, they begin to make calls from this phone box, under the eager ears of the police force. They discover that Madeleine had a meeting in a local estate agency. They follow her, and once she leaves, they question the agency employee. He has no idea who Madeleine Weber is. According to him, he just had a meeting with Madame Chevalier. When they run that name, they find an address for a storage unit being rented by a Madame Chevalier, very close to Madeleine's apartment. They ask their colleagues in Cannes to take a look, and bingo! Inside, they find Bernard's blue Renault 9. The good news keeps on rolling in for detectives. At the same time, they get a call from a colleague who tells them a torso has washed up on a riverbed. And guess what? It was found on the route between Nancy, where Simone Weber lives, and her daughter's house in Paris. However, no head, no arms and no legs, so difficult to identify. They used all the technology at their disposal, but it had been in the water for some time, and they were unable to ID the body. All they have is an x-ray of the skeleton, which does resemble that of Bernard's. They also have the case that the body was found in, so they bring in Patricia to see if she recognizes it. She confirms it was one of Bernard's 2 suitcases. It's the beginning of November now, 4 months after Bernard's disappearance, and they think it's time to act. They have Bernard's car and they have the torso, so on the 8th of November, the 2 sisters are arrested. They search Madeleine's house in Cannes and they find the vehicle documentation and also the keys for the car. When questioned, she claims she has no idea how they got there. They take her handcuffed down to the garage where Bernard's car was parked, and she finally concedes that she rented the box on the request of her sister, but purely to help Bernard out so his car didn't get damaged. As this is going on in Cannes, Simone is being taken into custody simultaneously. When they search her place, they hit the jackpot. They find weapons, plural, a .22 long rifle equipped with a silencer, loaded. Oh, and a few sticks of dynamite too. She states she needed them for self-defense as she lived in a rough area. Not exactly what you'd expect to find in the house of a little 55-year-old woman. As well as the weapons, they also find stacks and stacks of papers. Everything one could need to fake it. Town hall stamps, blank medical and prescription forms. It gets even more interesting. They also find invoices and there's one in particular that draws their attention. It's an invoice for an angle grinder. It's like a mini circular saw, rented on June the 21st to be returned on the 28th. So she rented this saw the day before Bernard went missing, and then a few days later, she declared it lost. But when they search her car, they find it in the boot. Detectives hadn't forgotten the witness statements. A heavy object falling to the ground, followed by the sound of a loud machine, possibly an angle grinder, and then trips to the car at 6 in the morning. Okay, I'm just gonna say what we are all thinking. She shot him with a rifle, he fell to the ground, and then she sawed him up into pieces. There, said it. They also find letters written by Simone to Bernard where she accuses him of meeting up with other women. She comes across as being incredibly jealous and a little bit crazy. That gives officers a motive too. When questioned, she denies having any involvement with him. She suggests that he probably just ran off with one of his lady friends. She has an answer for every question they throw at her. So they press harder. They tell her that they'd arrested her sister and that they found Bernard's car. She says her sister has nothing to do with this. Both sisters, in fact, hold firm and keep to their story. Nonetheless, on the 10th of November 85, they are thrown into prison awaiting trial. But no proof and no real corpse that they can ID. What if the answer lay in Simone's past? She was born in 1929, part of a working class family with 4 other siblings. She suffered from some serious health issues when she was young, which seriously hampered her ambitions. She wanted to become a nurse, but she had pleurisy, which meant she was forced to live in the mountains, and therefore she was unable to complete her studies. At the age of 18, she meets a man with whom she would have 5 kids, but the relationship quickly turns sour. He's a heavy drinker and he kicks her out. So at 28, she finds herself alone looking after the 5 kids. In 68, her eldest daughter, Catherine, dies at the school infirmary. She overdosed on theroline, which was a common medicine given to kids who had cough issues. She would attempt to then sue the school, claiming they were responsible for her daughter's death. She even consumed the drugs herself and gave it to her kids in large quantities to prove that you couldn't die from this. However, this stunt gets her nowhere. The school is exonerated, but she would never really get over the death of this daughter. Then 4 years later, with her kids having left home, she replies to an ad in the local paper. Marcel Fixard, 77 years old, is looking for a partner, someone of a similar age, with no kids, someone he could spend the rest of his life with. Simone is only 47 and she has children, so she creates a new persona to match Marcel's criteria and they hit it off. She lies about her age, her children, her marital status, and she wears a grey wig to make her look older than she actually is. She also claims to be a retired philosophy professor. Thankfully for her, no one ever questions her on it. In 77, more tragic news. She learns of the death of one of her sons. She's at Marcel Fixard's house when her sister announces the news to her. Trouble is, she's told Marcel she doesn't have any kids, so she claims that it's her nephew who died. It turns out her son Philippe had shot himself in his car to avoid being called up for military service. They are still together on the 10th of May 1981 when Marcel suffers a heart attack and dies. At the time, this passing aroused no suspicions, but 5 years later, as officers are rooting through her belongings, the discovery of this suspicious relationship and resulting death piles more pressure on Madame Weber's shoulders. The Fixard family learn of their marriage the day after the funeral while they're all in the parlour together. She introduces herself to the family as Madame Fixard. Everyone is speechless. They'd never even met her before. When police check with the town hall where they were supposedly married, there is no record of it ever happening. So we have a fake marriage, a suspect death, a missing and very probably dead second man. What if she got rid of Fixard to get hold of his money and now she's done the same thing 5 years later? They discover that she was his one and only inheritor, but a few weeks before his death, he had modified his will in favour of his nephew. It's only when she goes to the lawyers after his death that she finds out. So guess what? 3 days later, she goes back to the lawyer's office with another will. Fake, of course. Written 3 days before her death, and giving her 100% rights to his inheritance. But still no proof. How did she cause the death of Marcel Fixard? She is so clever. 10th of December, they search her property again. This time they find a prescription for digitaline, which, if consumed in high doses, could provoke a heart attack. And guess when the prescriptions were dated? The first prescription the day before the death of Marcel Fixard, and the second the day before the disappearance of Bernard Hettier. Neighbours back up this hypothesis. They state Bernard always seemed poorly after she'd been around, but when she wasn't there, he seemed fine fiddle. From her prison cell, Madame Weber is as aggressive as ever. She attacks the newspapers for defamation, and she even demands Fixard's body be exhumed to prove that there was no poison in his system. Early on the following year, this takes place in front of TV cameras. The body's been there for 6 years, and they dig it up for another autopsy. And she's right, they find no trace of poison, but it's been a long time. Experts conclude that it's not surprising they didn't find anything, and she knew that. What if she is telling the truth? What if she's just the victim of a terrible coincidence? The judge finds her guilty of falsifying her marriage certificate and falsifying the will, allegedly written by Marcel Fixard. The judge also gets the results back on the saw found in the boot of Simone's car. The report does state that it was taken apart and then put back together, that it had been thoroughly cleaned, and that it did contain some human substance on it, but impossible to say what and from whom. A year into the inquiry, and everyone is pretty sure that she did this, but there is still no real proof, and she is holding firm. By September of '86, she has been in custody for 10 months. She is once again questioned by the judge, and when she leaves his office, she doesn't hesitate to discredit him on live TV.
Quand on accuse les gens de couper les bras, les jambes, etc., eh bien, il faut au moins le prouver, et il refuse de le prouver, alors c'est un assassin moral, c'est un bandit.
As this war of words continues, the public is unaware that detectives are working on another clue from the suitcase found in the river. Remember, it had been weighed down with a cinder block. On this cinder block was paint, blue paint, a very specific blue they had spotted at Madame Weber's house on the gutters. They test it, and its chemical composition is an exact match. The evidence is building, but they still search for more. They go back to her house, they turn it over, they dig up the ground in her garden looking for more evidence. She even helps them out. She knows they're not going to find anything there. She is not fazed at all. In June '87, the judge goes even further. He demands that the canal be completely emptied. They do find 2 discs from a saw down there, but they don't match the machine found in Simone Weber's boot. In November '87, she goes on the counterattack. Her lawyers plan a very public reenactment of the supposed event. They take a chicken to prove it would have been impossible to cut up a human body without making a huge mess and alerting the neighbours. The judge shuts it down, but a year later a reenactment does take place on his terms. They take various cuts of meat, the objective to find out if she could have cut up the body. Using a similar angle grinder, they succeed with ease, making almost no mess. For the judge, it proves the crime could have very well taken place in the apartment. On the 27th of January '91, her trial begins. France is fascinated. The room is full to the brim. She attempts to orchestrate the trial from the beginning. She is loud. She insults witnesses. She has an answer for everything. At one point, the tension overflows. Patricia has to be escorted from the room. Just towards the end of the trial, Madame Weber faints also. It's from a hospital bed that she discovers she's been sentenced to 20 years for the murder of Bernard Hettier. In the case of Marcel Fixard, she is given the benefit of the doubt and is acquitted. She was released from the women's prison in Rennes in November '99. Having spent just 8 years in prison, she was released due to good behaviour, and she still claims her innocence. Now 86, she lives in the same block of flats as her sister in Cannes, herself condemned back in the day to 2 years for destroying evidence. Let me know in the comments what you think about this case. Does anyone really think she didn't do this? And how about poor Marcel Fixard? She was exonerated, but do you think she also finished him off for the money? It's easy to look at a fragile old lady and think there's no way she'd do such a thing. As the author Robert Greene once said, we do not see people as they are, but as they appear to us, and these appearances are usually misleading. Make sure you think about that before you trust a little old lady. Tap the subscribe button if you enjoyed this video and enable notifications. That way, every time we release a new video, you will not miss out. Until next time, stay safe and look after yourselves.